Hi, my name is Riley Moody, and I'm here with my friend Karen McLean, and this is Two Teenagers Talk About History.
All right, today's episode title is Defying the Odds, the story of Harriet Tubman. We're going to go over her life story as well as some misconceptions about it.
Now, Harriet Tubman, her real name was actually Araminta Ross, and her mother had nicknamed her Minty. She was born... people say that she was born in 1822. There's actually a lot of confusion behind her actual birth year.
Oh, really?
Tubman said that she was born in 1825, and her death records say that it was 1815, while her gravestone says 1820. And a historian working on one of the biographies for Tubman stated that she was born in 1822, and now that is the widely accepted claim that it was sometime around March. She was born in Dorchester County, Maryland, and she lived on a plantation owned by Edward Brodess with 8 other children. A lot of these children were unfortunately separated from the family and forced to go out onto other plantations through the slave trade. She had a lot of jobs growing up, and she really started out as a nursemaid. And then she moved on to a different part of the plantation and did other work for other owners. She would check traps, she would do field work, plowing, hauling, and these were a lot of the jobs she got when she was a little older. And she also was responsible for driving oxen. She was brutally abused and beaten, which was unfortunately the case for a lot of different slaves. And she was also neglected and overworked, sometimes even having to work when she was sick with the measles or other types of diseases commonly found during this time period.
Oh my goodness. Now, Harriet Tubman had experienced lots of brutality, as mentioned before, but one of the catalyst events that happened in her life is when she was 13. She was running an errand out at the market, and while she was there, she saw this slave that was attempting to escape to freedom, and his owner was chasing after him and trying to capture him. And the owner tried to recruit Harriet to capture him, and she was like, "No, I'm not doing that," which is good.
That's very reasonable.
Now, the slave owner was so mad at his escapee that he threw a 2-pound weight at the escapee, but he accidentally hit Harriet in the back of the head. And this injury fractured her skull and caused her to have violent seizures and chronic headaches. Historians believe that Harriet Tubman may have narcolepsy due to the incident, which, as she described it, as sleeping spells, where she would hallucinate visions of her freedom. Now, her mother was able to care for her and nurse her back to health, but her symptoms still persisted throughout the rest of her life.
Now, this is actually really crazy for me because I never heard of this happening in her life. I think something that's so crazy about stories like Harriet's is the fact that so many of their previous traumas and abuse, all of that often gets neglected and overshadowed by their achievements. And while their achievements are very, very crucial to history, and they're very applaudable, very celebrated, it's also important to look back and recognize and identify the abuse and the hardships and all of these other horrible things that these people had to go through in order to both find the courage and the motivation to do what they did in the future, but to also really shape themselves as people.
Yeah, I was completely unaware of this until I started researching. Because when you think of Harriet Tubman, the first thing you think of is the Underground Railroad. Because that's what you always learned in school, because she's always associated with that.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because that is an incredible thing that she did, and she saved so many people.
Absolutely, yeah.
But why is her narcolepsy considered a disability? Why is that overlooked? If anything, it makes her accomplishments even more admirable because she was able to go through this while being essentially disabled.
Exactly. And she was also still kind of forced to continue working after that injury. Even if she had recovered to an extent, she was still in this position where this type of hard work and this rough labor was not good for her condition. And if she did actually have narcolepsy, which it's highly plausible, that's really saying something about a lot of the slave owners at this time, because some of these more documented cases, like Tubman's, they have like all of these different things about their owners, about the plantation they grew up on, about that living situation, about their stuff like that. But with a lot of the other ones, like stuff like the regular slaves who most likely died sometime during their work as a slave or after they were freed, after they ran away, they don't get talked about nearly enough. And it's really sad to think that what was so brutal for Harriet, like 2 pounds, that's insane, to the back of her head.
And it was thrown, not like gravity. Just
that could have killed her.
Oh yeah, very
that really could have killed her. And it's so scary to think about how this was probably much lighter than anything that happened to a lot of different slaves at this time. A lot of these people were raped. They were forced to have children. They were often beaten to death, hung, burned, all of these different things just because they couldn't match the expectations that their owners had for them.
A few years after the incident, Harriet Tubman was able to reach an agreement with her enslaver, and instead of being told where to work and what to do for her enslaver, if she would pay a small fee to him, she could hire herself out for work, and she could be in places all around Maryland. This ended up being a really good thing because she ended up working on a timber mill, and her father was also there, who she had been separated from at a very young age. Mm-hmm. So she was able to reconnect with him and build a relationship with him, which I'm sure she always wanted because she was a big family woman. Mm-hmm. That was the whole reason that she had returned to Maryland after she had escaped in the first place, because she wanted to save her family and her friends. Now, when she was going out on these jobs that she chose, she was all around the marshlands of Maryland, and she became an expert with that terrain, which is very hard to traverse, by the way, all the water, tree roots, everything. And this later became useful to the Union Army. So when she was working with her father in these timber mills, she was not only able to connect with him, but also groups of black sailors who would go all around the coast. And they were very connected with certain groups of abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. This was, obviously, vital to Harriet Tubman's escape and her rescues that happened then after. Mm-hmm. Around this time, she was 22 years old, and she married John Tubman, who was a free man at the time. And she changed her name from Araminta, or Minty, to Harriet. And historians believe that was most likely after her mother, who her name was also Harriet. When her enslaver, Edward Brodess, died, Tubman feared for her and her family being sold and separated even more. So with the help of her fellow abolitionists, she made her way to Pennsylvania to discover freedom.
Now, when Tubman escaped from slavery and she had moved to Philadelphia, got herself settled, all of that stuff, people had reached out to her and asked for her help in the Underground Railroad operation. And what's so crazy about the Underground Railroad is, contrary to its name and popular expectations and depictions, this was not a railroad. It was just a series of houses and living areas, and it was kind of labeled as a railroad.
Well, it was like a path to freedom, mm-hmm. So it was filled with all the safe houses.
And once she was working with the Underground Railroad, she had found this sort of courage, this sort of motivation to go back to Maryland and to rescue her family from slavery and to help them escape. And that was sort of that domino effect where once she had freed her family successfully, when she had gotten them to safety, she went back for more and more people. You know, some people, they didn't want to go back. They were afraid of leaving, and that was understandable because of how brutal the consequences would be if they were caught escaping. And we mentioned earlier that Harriet had a husband, and she was married to a free black man. And once she had initially escaped and gone back once, twice, 3 times, on the 3rd time, she had gone back for her husband. But the crazy part is that her husband presumed that Harriet was dead and had already remarried to another woman whom was already pregnant with his child. Now, Harriet was rightfully heartbroken at this sudden twist of events in her life. She most likely didn't expect for something like this to happen, but unfortunately, that was undoubtedly the case for people like Harriet. She left without a trace, pretty much, and it was right to assume that she had perished either during her escape or before her escape. And despite her heartbreak, she still insisted on keeping that commitment and making sure that everyone she could get to that safety, that freedom. And she offered to take John and his new wife, but John said no, and then she said okay, and she just carried on.
And fun fact, for those who had already committed to the journey, if they had second thoughts or second guesses, she would actually carry a small handgun with her, not only just for protection in general, but also to be like, if you go back and you snitch, it ain't gonna be good. Like, one of her phrases was, you either be free or you die, which seems drastic, but in the circumstances, I honestly don't think it was.
I think it was very realistic for her to say that, because it was such a subjective term. It's either you're free or you die. And this dying could be dying through slavery, dying after being caught, dying once Harriet realized that they had snitched on her about her plan and her operation and everything falling through. It was a very drastic time, especially with the Civil War, and how people were so adamant on getting as many free slaves as they possibly could before the release of the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, and the overall freedom of slaves.
After this, she actually served as a Union spy during the Civil War because of her extensive knowledge of the wetlands and marshlands in Maryland. Now, we are going to now dive into some of the misconceptions and exaggerations of her story. Sometimes in famous stories, people like to over-exaggerate, like, she did all of this, and it's like, yes, she did amazing things, but you shouldn't be fancying up to where it's not true. And I've never met Harriet Tubman, obviously, but I think she would appreciate having the real truth out there and not some dazzled version.
I feel like having these exaggerated stories kind of says something about our society today, in a way. How these big stories only really get out if they have a lot of that extra flair. And even the small accomplishments, which at the time, Harriet's accomplishment of 70 slaves was incredible. It was groundbreaking. 70 whole slaves. It's so amazing and remarkable looking back, but people today might not think that that's something to really write home about.
Exactly.
But it was. Even if it wasn't this remarkable number of like 100, 200, 300.
300 was the number that someone wrote in a biography. It's 300 people in 19 trips. But a public meeting Harriet held once, she insisted that it's like, I saved around 70 people in about 13 trips. Okay, that is just about all the time we have for today. But let us know if you have any other suggestions of someone we should speak about in history. Any feedback or insights you have, we'd love to hear it. A special thanks to our sources. We used the nationalparkservice.gov to learn about Harriet Tubman, as well as the womenshistory.org to learn about her as well. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Thanks for listening, guys. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
Okay, bye.